In the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, where split-second decisions mean the difference between coming home alive or in a flag-draped coffin, Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez learned that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one you can see. It's the one hiding behind red tape and protocol. When radio chatter dies and your squad is caught in a deadly ambush 400 meters from safety, bureaucracy becomes your worst enemy. This is the story of a soldier who had to choose between following orders and saving lives, and how one denied request for permission to engage turned into the most important shot she never thought she'd have to take. Some battles are fought with bullets, others are fought with courage to break the rules when lives hang in the balance. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of the Kunar province as Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez adjusted her grip on her M4 carbine. The weight of the weapon felt familiar in her hands, like an extension of her own body after 3 tours in Afghanistan. She had earned her stripes the hard way, through countless patrols and firefights that had tested not just her marksmanship skills, but her ability to make life-or-death decisions under pressure. Rodriguez was leading a reconnaissance patrol through one of the most dangerous valleys in the region. Intelligence reports had indicated increased Taliban activity in the area, and their mission was simple: gather information about enemy movements and report back to base. What should have been a routine patrol was about to become anything but routine. The patrol consisted of 8 soldiers, all seasoned veterans who had learned to trust each other's instincts. Corporal Jake Williams served as the radio operator, his pack heavy with communication equipment that would keep them connected to their base. Private First Class Sarah Chen was their medic, always ready with her aid bag to patch up wounded soldiers. The rest of the team included riflemen and a machine gunner, each playing a crucial role in keeping the patrol safe. Rodriguez had grown up in a small town in Texas, where she learned to shoot before she learned to drive. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, had taught her that shooting wasn't just about hitting a target, it was about discipline, patience, and making every shot count. Those lessons had served her well in the army, where she had become one of the best markswomen in her unit. As they moved through the valley, Rodriguez couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The usual sounds of village life were absent. No children playing, no farmers tending to their crops, no elderly men sitting in the shade discussing the day's events. The silence was deafening, and it made every soldier in the patrol nervous. The terrain was unforgiving, with steep rocky slopes on both sides of the valley and limited cover. If they were attacked, there would be few places to hide. Rodriguez had studied the maps extensively before the mission, identifying potential ambush sites and escape routes. She knew that in this part of Afghanistan, the enemy had the advantage of knowing the terrain better than any American soldier ever could. Williams broke the silence with a crackling radio transmission from their base. "Alpha Team, this is base. Be advised, we have reports of possible enemy activity in your area. Stay alert and report any suspicious movement." Rodriguez acknowledged the transmission and signaled for her team to spread out. They had been walking in a loose column formation, but now they needed to be ready for anything. The soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, each knowing their role without needing verbal commands. The valley they were traversing was known locally as the Valley of Ghosts because of the many soldiers who had disappeared there over the years. Both American and Soviet forces had suffered losses in this unforgiving landscape, and the Taliban used it as a major smuggling route for weapons and fighters moving between Pakistan and the more populated areas of Afghanistan. Rodriguez had studied the history of military operations in the region, and she knew that successful patrols required more than just good training and equipment. They required understanding the enemy's tactics and being able to think like them. The Taliban fighters were experts at using the terrain to their advantage, setting up ambushes in locations where foreign troops would be most vulnerable. As they continued their patrol, Rodriguez noticed fresh tire tracks in the dirt road. The tracks were from motorcycles, which the Taliban often used for quick movement through the mountains. She called a halt to the patrol and examined the tracks more closely. They were recent, probably from the night before, and they headed in the same direction the patrol was traveling. Chen moved up beside Rodriguez and whispered, "Sarge, this doesn't feel right. The whole village is empty, and now we've got fresh motorcycle tracks. Maybe we should call for backup." Rodriguez considered the suggestion. The rules of engagement were clear about when they could call for additional support, but they also had a mission to complete. Intelligence gathering was crucial for future operations, and turning back now would mean losing valuable information about enemy movements. Williams joined them, his radio ready for transmission. "What's the word, Sarge? Do we continue or pull back?" Rodriguez looked at the terrain ahead. The valley narrowed about 400 meters further on, creating a perfect choke point for an ambush. But it was also the location where they were most likely to gather the intelligence they needed. The decision wasn't easy, but Rodriguez had learned to trust her instincts, and right now they were telling her to proceed with caution. We continue, she decided. But we modify our approach. Williams, get on the radio and let base know our situation. Tell them we're proceeding to the objective, but we want close air support on standby. Chen, make sure your aid bag is ready. Everyone else, weapons hot and eyes open. The patrol resumed movement, but now every soldier was on high alert. Rodriguez took point, using her experience to guide them through the safest possible route. She had learned to read the landscape like a book, identifying potential threats and safe areas with the skill of someone who had survived multiple combat deployments. As they approached the narrow part of the valley, Rodriguez's training kicked in. She had attended advanced marksmanship school and had become proficient with multiple weapon systems. Her M4 carbine was equipped with an ACOG scope that would allow her to engage targets at distances up to 600 meters with deadly accuracy. The weapon had been her companion through 2 previous deployments, and she had customized it to fit her shooting style perfectly. The trigger pull was smooth and consistent, and the scope was zeroed precisely for her preferred shooting positions. She had fired thousands of rounds through this particular rifle, and she knew exactly how it would perform under different conditions. Rodriguez had also earned her Expert Infantry badge, a qualification that required not just marksmanship skills, but also proficiency in tactics, first aid, and land navigation. The training had been grueling, but it had prepared her for situations exactly like this one. The patrol moved in bounds, with one team providing cover while another advanced. It was a technique they had practiced countless times, and it allowed them to move quickly while maintaining security. Rodriguez coordinated the movement with hand signals, keeping radio chatter to a minimum to avoid giving away their position. As they entered the narrow part of the valley, Rodriguez felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came before combat. Her senses were heightened, and she found herself noticing details that would normally escape attention. The way the rocks were positioned, the patterns of wear on the dirt road, the complete absence of birds or other wildlife. Williams received another transmission. From base, Alpha Team, we have your close air support request. Be advised, rules of engagement require visual confirmation of hostile intent before engaging. Do not fire unless fired upon or until you have clear evidence of immediate threat. Rodriguez acknowledged the transmission, but she felt a growing sense of unease. The rules of engagement were designed to prevent civilian casualties, but they also meant that her patrol might have to absorb the first shots of any engagement. In a well-planned ambush, those first shots could be devastating. The narrow part of the valley was about 100 meters long, with steep rocky slopes on both sides rising to heights of over 300 meters. It was the perfect place for an ambush, with multiple firing positions and limited escape routes. Rodriguez knew that if they were going to be attacked, this is where it would happen. She signaled for the patrol to halt just before entering the narrow section. Using binoculars, she carefully scanned the ridgelines and rock formations ahead, looking for any sign of enemy presence. The silence was still unnerving, and the absence of any local population was a clear indicator that something was wrong. Chen moved up beside her again. Sarge, I've got a bad feeling about this. Maybe we should find an alternate route. Rodriguez lowered her binoculars and considered the options. There were other routes through the mountains, but they would add hours to their mission and might be just as dangerous. The intelligence they were seeking was time-sensitive, and delays could mean missing important information about enemy plans. Williams was monitoring radio traffic from other units in the area. Sarge, I'm hearing reports of increased Taliban activity all along this corridor. Multiple units are reporting contact with enemy forces. The information confirmed what Rodriguez had suspected. The Taliban were conducting a coordinated operation and her patrol had walked into the middle of it. The question now was whether to continue with the mission or withdraw to safety. Rodriguez made her decision based on years of experience and training. We're going through, but we're going to do it smart. Williams, you and Chen stay here and provide overwatch. If things go bad, you can provide covering fire while the rest of us move to safety. Everyone else, we're moving through in 2 teams. I'll take point with Johnson and Martinez. Stevens, you take the rear with Thompson and Baker. The soldiers acknowledged the plan and prepared to move. Rodriguez checked her weapon one more time, ensuring that the safety was off and that she had a full magazine. She had 210 rounds of ammunition in 7 30-round magazines, enough for a sustained firefight if necessary. As they prepared to enter the narrow section of the valley, Rodriguez thought about her family back home in Texas. Her mother would be getting ready for work at the local school where she taught 3rd grade. Her father would be having his morning coffee and reading the newspaper. They worried about her every day she was deployed, but they also understood why she had chosen this profession. Rodriguez had joined the army not for adventure or excitement, but because she believed in serving her country and protecting the freedoms that Americans enjoyed. She had seen the worst that humanity had to offer during her deployments, but she had also seen acts of courage and sacrifice that restored her faith in human nature. The patrol began moving through the narrow section, with Rodriguez leading the way. Every step brought them closer to potential danger, but also closer to completing their mission. She kept her weapon ready, and her eyes scanning the ridgelines for any sign of movement. The silence continued to be unnerving. In most parts of Afghanistan, there would be some signs of life even in remote areas. The fact that this valley was completely empty suggested that the local population had been warned to stay away. That warning could have come from Taliban fighters preparing for an operation. Rodriguez had learned to trust her instincts during her previous deployments. Those instincts had saved her life more than once, and right now they were screaming that danger was near. But she also knew that her mission was important, and that the intelligence they were seeking could save other American lives. As they reached the halfway point through the narrow section, Rodriguez saw something that made her blood run cold. There, carved into a rock face about 200 meters ahead, was a fresh Taliban marking. The symbol indicated that this area was under Taliban control, and it served as a warning to anyone who might challenge that control. The marking confirmed what Rodriguez had suspected from the beginning. They were walking into an ambush zone, and the enemy was prepared for their arrival. Rodriguez raised her fist, signaling the patrol to halt immediately. The fresh Taliban marking on the rock face ahead wasn't just graffiti. It was a tactical indicator that enemy fighters had been in this area recently and considered it their territory. The crude symbol, carved with a knife or sharp stone, was still showing white stone underneath, meaning it had been made within the last few days. She pulled out her binoculars again and began a systematic scan of every possible firing position along the ridgelines. The afternoon sun was creating shadows that could easily conceal enemy fighters, and Rodriguez knew the Taliban snipers were experts at using natural camouflage. A fighter, wrapped in an earth-colored blanket and positioned among the rocks, could be virtually invisible until he started shooting. Williams had remained in the overwatch position with Chen, and his voice crackled through the radio with urgency. "Alpha Leader, I'm seeing movement on the eastern ridgeline. Can't get a clear visual, but something's moving up there." Rodriguez shifted her focus to the eastern slope, scanning methodically from left to right. The Taliban often used the high ground to their advantage, positioning fighters where they could observe American patrols long before they could be spotted themselves. After several minutes of careful observation, she caught a glimpse of what Williams had seen. A brief flash of movement among the rocks about 300 meters up the slope. The movement could have been an animal, but Rodriguez's experience told her otherwise. The way it moved was distinctly human, and it appeared to be in a position that provided an excellent view of the narrow section of valley they were currently occupying. If it was an enemy fighter, he would have been watching their approach for some time. Johnson, one of her most experienced soldiers, moved up beside her in a low crouch. He was a veteran of 4 deployments and had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense danger. "Sarge, this whole situation stinks. Empty village, fresh markings, movement on the ridgeline. We're walking into something big." Rodriguez nodded grimly. All the indicators pointed to a well-planned ambush, but they still didn't have clear evidence of hostile intent that would justify engaging potential targets. The rules of engagement required visual confirmation of weapons or actual hostile action before they could open fire. It was a constraint that often frustrated soldiers who could sense danger but couldn't act on that intuition. Martinez, the patrol's machine gunner, had positioned himself with a clear field of fire toward the suspected enemy position. His M249 light machine gun was loaded with 200 rounds of linked ammunition, and he had additional ammunition ready for a sustained firefight. Despite his heavy weapon and the tactical advantage it provided, he couldn't engage without proper authorization. "Williams," Rodriguez called softly into a radio, "get base on the line. I need to speak with the commanding officer about our rules of engagement. We've got indicators of enemy presence but no clear hostile intent yet." While Williams worked to establish communication with their base, Rodriguez continued to study the terrain ahead. The narrow section of the valley continued for another 200 meters before opening up into a wider area where they would have more room to maneuver if attacked. The problem was that 200 meters represented nearly 3 minutes of careful movement, and that was plenty of time for hidden enemies to prepare a devastating ambush. Chen's voice came through the radio from the overwatch position. "Sarge, I'm seeing additional movement now. Looks like at least 2, maybe 3 individuals on the western ridgeline. They're staying low, but they're definitely human." The situation was escalating rapidly. Multiple enemy fighters in elevated positions, with clear fields of fire down into the valley, represented exactly the kind of tactical nightmare that infantry soldiers were trained to avoid. Rodriguez knew that if they continued forward, they would be walking into what could be a perfectly executed ambush. Williams finally got through to their base. "Alpha Leader, I have base command on the line. They want to speak with you directly." Rodriguez took the handset and spoke in a low, urgent voice. "Base command, this is Alpha Leader. We have multiple indicators of enemy presence in our area. Fresh Taliban markings, multiple personnel observed on ridgelines in tactical positions, complete absence of civilian population. Requesting permission to engage suspected enemy positions." The response came back quickly but wasn't what Rodriguez wanted to hear. "Alpha Leader, negative on permission to engage. Rules of engagement require clear hostile action or visual confirmation of weapons before you are authorized to fire. Continue mission or withdraw if you assess situation as too dangerous." Rodriguez felt a surge of frustration. The voice on the radio belonged to someone sitting safely in a command bunker, making decisions about rules of engagement without having to live with the consequences. The book said one thing, but the reality on the ground was telling her something entirely different. She handed the radio back to Williams and gathered her team leaders for a quick conference. Johnson and Martinez moved in close while Stevens covered their position and watched for any change in the tactical situation. "Here's what we know," Rodriguez said quietly. "We've got multiple enemy fighters in elevated positions, fresh Taliban markings indicating recent activity, and a completely empty civilian population. Command says no engagement without clear hostile action, but if we wait for that, it might be too late." Johnson shook his head in frustration. "Sarge, those fighters up there have been watching us for who knows how long. They're in perfect ambush positions, and we're sitting ducks down here in this valley. If we keep moving forward, we're going to get hit hard." Martinez agreed. "The smart tactical move is to withdraw and find another route. We can't complete our mission if we're all dead, and right now this feels like a death trap." Rodriguez understood their concerns, but she also knew that withdrawing would mean abandoning their mission and potentially missing crucial intelligence that could save other American lives. The information they were seeking could reveal Taliban plans for future attacks, and that intelligence had value that went beyond the immediate safety of their patrol. Stevens, who had been quietly observing the ridgelines, suddenly spoke up. "Movement on the eastern slope. Looks like someone with a rifle." All eyes turned toward the position Stevens had indicated. Through her binoculars, Rodriguez could see a figure among the rocks that appeared to be carrying a weapon. The distance made it difficult to identify the specific type of weapon, but the posture and positioning suggested someone preparing for combat. This was the moment Rodriguez had been dreading. They now had visual confirmation of an armed individual in a position to threaten their patrol, but the rules of engagement still required them to wait for actual hostile action before responding. It was a constraint that could prove deadly in a situation like this. Williams received another transmission from their base. "Alpha Team, be advised we have reports of American forces taking fire in sectors adjacent to your area. Multiple units are reporting contact with enemy forces. Exercise extreme caution." The information confirmed that they were indeed in the middle of a coordinated Taliban operation. Enemy fighters were engaging American forces throughout the region, which meant that the individuals they had spotted on the ridgelines were almost certainly part of the same coordinated attack. Rodriguez made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her military career. Despite having visual confirmation of armed individuals in threatening positions, and despite receiving reports of active combat in adjacent areas, she decided to follow the rules of engagement and wait for clear hostile action before responding. "We continue the mission," she announced to her team, "but we're going to move fast and stay ready for anything. Johnson, you take point. Martinez, you're covering our 6. Stevens, watch the eastern ridgeline. I'll take the western slope. If anyone sees muzzle flash or incoming fire, light them up immediately." The patrol began moving again, but now every soldier was operating with heightened awareness. They moved in short bounds, with each soldier covering a different sector of the surrounding terrain. The silence in the valley had become oppressive, and the weight of unseen eyes watching their every move was almost tangible. Rodriguez kept her M4 carbine ready, with the safety off and a round chambered. She had adjusted her ACOG scope for the distance to the suspected enemy positions, and she knew she could deliver accurate fire within seconds of identifying a target. The question was whether she would have those crucial seconds when the shooting started. Chan and Williams continued to provide overwatch from their position at the rear of the patrol. From their elevated position, they could see both the patrol's movement and the suspected enemy positions on the ridgelines. Their job was to provide covering fire if the patrol came under attack and to coordinate any request for artillery or air support. As the patrol continued through the narrow section of the valley, Rodriguez couldn't shake the feeling that they were being herded into a trap. The Taliban were experts at channeling enemy forces into predetermined kill zones, and everything about this situation suggested that they were walking into exactly that kind of tactical setup. The silence was suddenly broken by a sound that made every soldier's blood run cold. The distinctive metallic click of a weapon being loaded. The sound came from somewhere on the eastern ridgeline, and it was followed immediately by similar sounds from multiple positions. Rodriguez knew they had seconds before the shooting started. The enemy fighters had been waiting for them to reach the optimal position for an ambush, and that moment had apparently arrived. She could feel the weight of command responsibility settling on her shoulders as she prepared to make decisions that would determine whether her soldiers lived or died. The next few minutes would test everything she had learned about combat leadership, marksmanship, and tactical decision-making. More importantly, they would test her ability to think clearly under pressure and make life-or-death decisions while rounds were flying and her soldiers were depending on her to get them home safely. Johnson, who was walking point, suddenly raised his weapon and aimed toward the eastern ridgeline. He had spotted something that made him believe an attack was imminent, but he was waiting for Rodriguez's command before engaging. The rules of engagement were clear, but the tactical situation was about to make those rules irrelevant. Rodriguez could see muzzle flashes beginning to appear among the rocks on both ridgelines. The Taliban fighters had decided that the American patrol was in the perfect position for their ambush, and they were preparing to open fire. In a few seconds, the narrow valley would become a killing field, and Rodriguez's patrol would be caught in a crossfire with no cover and limited options for escape. This was the moment when all her training, experience, and instincts would be put to the ultimate test. The enemy had chosen their ground carefully. They had superior numbers and position, and they had been planning this ambush for who knows how long. Rodriguez and her soldiers had walked into exactly the kind of tactical nightmare that kept infantry commanders awake at night. The first shots were about to be fired, and Rodriguez knew that her response in the next few seconds would determine whether her patrol survived the day. The first shot cracked across the valley like thunder, followed immediately by the high-pitched whine of a bullet ricocheting off the rocks near Johnson's position. The ambush had begun, and Rodriguez's worst fears were becoming reality. Muzzle flashes erupted from at least 6 different positions along both ridgelines, creating a devastating crossfire that turned the narrow valley into a death trap. "Contact! Contact!" Multiple shooters on both ridgelines. Johnson shouted into his radio as he dove behind the nearest boulder, barely avoiding a burst of automatic weapon fire that chewed up the ground where he had been standing just seconds before. Rodriguez's training took over immediately. "Take cover! Return fire! Williams, get on the radio and call for immediate support." She rolled behind a large rock outcropping and began scanning for targets through her ACOG scope. The enemy fighters were well concealed among the rocks, but their muzzle flashes gave away their positions. Martinez had found cover behind a fallen boulder and was setting up his M249 machine gun to provide suppressive fire. The heavy weapon could deliver devastating firepower, but he needed clear targets to be effective. "I can see at least 4 positions on the eastern slope, but they're using good cover. I'm going to lay down suppressing fire to keep their heads down." The sound of gunfire echoed off the valley walls, creating a deafening cacophony that made communication difficult. Bullets were hitting the rocks around the patrol with sharp cracks and metallic pings, sending stone fragments flying through the air. Rodriguez could feel the percussion of near misses as rounds passed close to her position. Stevens had found cover further back in the valley and was trying to get a clear shot at the western ridgeline. "I count at least 3 shooters on this side, maybe more. They're firing from prepared positions with good cover and concealment." The tactical situation was exactly what Rodriguez had feared. The Taliban fighters had prepared their ambush positions carefully, with overlapping fields of fire that covered the entire narrow section of the valley. They had waited for the American patrol to reach the optimal position before opening fire, ensuring maximum casualties with minimum risk to themselves. Williams was frantically working his radio, trying to coordinate support from their base. Base command, this is Alpha Team. We are taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Request immediate artillery support and close air support. Grid reference follows." The response came back through static and the sound of gunfire. "Alpha Team, we copy your contact report. Be advised, artillery support will take 15 minutes to coordinate. Air support is 30 minutes out. You're cleared to engage all hostile targets." Rodriguez felt a bitter irony in the authorization to engage. They now had permission to shoot back, but they were pinned down by well-positioned enemy fighters who had already seized the initiative. The rules of engagement that had prevented them from acting on their suspicions earlier were now irrelevant, but the damage was done. A burst of machine gun fire from the eastern ridgeline forced Rodriguez to duck lower behind her cover. The enemy fighters were using at least one PKM machine gun, a weapon that could punch through light cover, and had an effective range far superior to the American patrol's individual weapons. The distinctive sound of the heavy machine gun told Rodriguez that they were facing experienced fighters with quality equipment. Johnson was trying to work his way to a better firing position, but enemy fire was keeping him pinned down behind inadequate cover. "Sarge, I need covering fire to move to that rock pile about 20 meters ahead. From there I can get a better angle on the eastern positions." Rodriguez assessed the tactical situation quickly. Johnson's proposed movement would put him in a better position to engage the enemy, but the open ground he would have to cross was covered by multiple firing positions. It was a dangerous move, but it might be their only chance to gain some tactical advantage. "Martinez, can you give Johnson covering fire?" Rodriguez called out. Martinez was already repositioning his machine gun for a better field of fire. "Roger that, Sarge. I can suppress the eastern positions, but I'll need about 30 seconds to get set up." While Martinez prepared his covering fire, Rodriguez tried to locate targets of her own. Through her scope, she could see movement among the rocks on the western ridgeline. A Taliban fighter was moving between positions, probably trying to get a better angle on the trapped American patrol. Rodriguez carefully aimed and squeezed the trigger. Her shot rang out across the valley, and the moving figure stumbled and fell behind cover. Whether it was a hit or near miss, the shot had the desired effect of disrupting the enemy fighter's movement and forcing him to take cover. Martinez opened up with his machine gun, sending long bursts of suppressive fire toward the eastern ridgeline. The heavy weapon created a wall of lead that forced the enemy fighters to keep their heads down, giving Johnson the opportunity he needed to move to a better position. Johnson sprinted across the open ground in a low crouch, reaching the cover of the rock pile just as enemy fire shifted to his new position. Bullets sparked off the rocks around him, but he had made it safely to better cover. "Good move, Johnson. What's your situation?" Rodriguez called out. "I've got eyes on at least 2 positions from here. I can see muzzle flashes, but the shooters are well concealed. These guys know what they're doing." The realization that they were facing experienced fighters rather than hastily organized militants made Rodriguez reassess their tactical situation. Experienced Taliban fighters would have planned this ambush carefully, with escape routes and fallback positions already prepared. They would also have coordinated their attack with other operations in the area, which meant additional enemy forces might be moving to cut off the American patrol's withdrawal route. Chen and Williams were still in their overwatch position, but they were taking increasingly heavy fire from enemy positions that had spotted their location. "Alpha Leader, we're getting hit hard up here," Chen reported. "Multiple shooters have our position bracketed, and we can't move without exposing ourselves to fire from at least 3 directions." The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Rodriguez's patrol was split into 3 separate groups, each pinned down by enemy fire and unable to provide effective mutual support. The enemy had achieved tactical surprise and held all the advantages of terrain and position. In military terms, it was a textbook ambush that was proceeding exactly as the enemy had planned. Rodriguez tried to raise their base on the radio. "Base command, Alpha Team. We are heavily engaged and taking casualties. Need immediate support. Can you expedite artillery or air support?" The response was frustrating but not unexpected. "Alpha Team, artillery support is still 10 minutes out due to coordination requirements with other units in the area. Air support remains 25 minutes out. You are authorized to use all necessary force to break contact and withdraw to safety." The authorization to withdraw sounded simple over the radio, but the tactical reality made it nearly impossible. The narrow valley that had channeled them into the ambush also limited their options for escape. Moving back the way they had come would expose them to fire from both ridgelines, and moving forward would take them deeper into the kill zone. Stevens had been studying the terrain and had identified a possible escape route. "Sarge, there's a small ravine about 50 meters to our south. If we can reach it, it might provide cover for withdrawal. But we'd have to cross open ground under fire." Rodriguez used her binoculars to examine the ravine Stevens had identified. It was narrow and shallow, but it appeared to offer some concealment from the ridgeline positions. The problem was that reaching it would require coordinated movement under fire, and they would need effective covering fire to suppress the enemy positions. The sound of gunfire was beginning to attract attention from other enemy forces in the area. Rodriguez could hear the distant sound of motorcycles, which suggested that additional Taliban fighters were moving toward their position. If they didn't break contact soon, they would face an even larger enemy force with reinforcements arriving to surround them. Martinez had been conserving his ammunition, but he was starting to run low on linked belts for his machine gun. "Sarge, I've got maybe 200 rounds left. If we're going to make a move, it needs to be soon." Rodriguez made the tactical decision that would define the rest of the engagement. Rather than trying to fight their way out of the ambush, she decided to use the limited firepower they had to create an opportunity for withdrawal. It was a calculated risk that could either save her patrol or result in catastrophic casualties. "Here's the plan," she announced over the radio. "We're going to break contact and withdraw to that ravine Stevens identified. Martinez, you're going to lay down maximum suppressive fire on both ridgelines. Johnson, you and Stevens provide covering fire for the main group. Chen and Williams, you move first and establish overwatch on the ravine. Once you're in position, the rest of us will move by bounds." The plan was simple but dangerous. Success would depend on perfect timing and coordination, and any mistake could result in soldiers being caught in the open under heavy fire. But staying in their current positions meant certain death or capture, so the risk was worth taking. Chen and Williams acknowledged the plan and prepared to move. They would have to sprint across 50 meters of open ground while under fire from multiple positions, but their movement would signal the beginning of the withdrawal and hopefully catch the enemy off guard. Rodriguez checked her ammunition and prepared to provide covering fire. She had fired 8 rounds from her current magazine, leaving her with 22 rounds before she would need to reload. Her other magazines were secure in their pouches, but reloading under fire would cost precious seconds that could mean the difference between life and death. Martinez was ready with his machine gun, and Johnson and Stevens had identified their targets and fields of fire. The success of their plan would depend on overwhelming the enemy positions with such heavy fire that the Taliban fighters would be unable to effectively engage the moving Americans. Rodriguez took a deep breath and prepared to give the order that would either save her patrol or lead to disaster. The next few minutes would test everything she had learned about small unit tactics, leadership under pressure, and the kind of courage that separated good soldiers from great ones. The ambush that had started as the enemy's tactical advantage was about to become a test of American training, equipment, and determination. Rodriguez knew that her decisions in the next few minutes would determine whether her soldiers went home to their families or became casualties in a remote Afghan valley that most Americans had never heard of. "Execute! Execute! Execute!" Rodriguez shouted into her radio, and the carefully orchestrated withdrawal began with a thunderous roar of American firepower that echoed off the valley walls like an avalanche of steel and determination. Martinez opened up with his M249 machine gun, sending long, sustained bursts toward both ridgelines. The heavy weapon hammered out round after round, creating a wall of suppressive fire that forced the Taliban fighters to duck behind cover. The machine gun's distinctive sound was joined by the sharp cracks of M4 rifles as Johnson and Stevens added their fire to the deadly symphony. Chen and Williams burst from their covered position like sprinters leaving the starting blocks, running in a low crouch across the open ground toward the ravine. Bullets whined past them and kicked up dirt at their feet, but the suppressive fire from their teammates was keeping the enemy's aim disrupted. Every second felt like an eternity as they covered the 50 meters of exposed terrain. Rodriguez tracked targets through her scope, looking for any enemy fighter who tried to expose himself to get a clear shot at the running Americans. She caught sight of a muzzle flash from a position on the eastern ridgeline and quickly aimed and fired. Her shot struck the rocks near the enemy position, sending stone fragments flying and forcing the fighter to duck back behind cover. Williams stumbled as a bullet passed close to his head, but he recovered his balance and continued running. Chen, carrying her heavy medic pack, was breathing hard but maintaining the pace. They were halfway to the ravine when a burst of machine gun fire from the western ridgeline bracketed their position, but Martinez's return fire forced the enemy gunner to shift his aim. 20 meters from safety, Chen's boot caught on a loose rock and she went down hard, her equipment scattering across the ground. Williams immediately stopped and turned back to help her, exposing both of them to concentrated enemy fire. Rodriguez could see muzzle flashes appearing along both ridgelines as the Taliban fighters recognized the vulnerability of the two Americans in the open. "Chen's down! Chen's down!" Williams shouted into his radio as he grabbed the medic and started dragging her toward cover. Rodriguez made a split-second decision that saved both their lives. She shifted her fire to the nearest enemy position on the western ridgeline, where she had spotted a fighter trying to get a clear shot at the struggling Americans. Her first round missed, but her second and third shots struck the target, and the muzzle flashes from that position stopped immediately. Johnson had also spotted the threat and was directing accurate fire toward the eastern positions. His marksmanship training was paying off as he systematically engaged each muzzle flash with carefully aimed shots that forced the enemy fighters to keep their heads down. Stevens was working his way through his ammunition methodically, picking targets and engaging them with the precision of a trained sniper. He had identified the enemy machine gun position and was attempting to neutralize it with concentrated fire, knowing that the heavy weapon posed the greatest threat to their withdrawal. Chen and Williams finally reached the relative safety of the ravine, but both were breathing hard, and Chen was favoring her left ankle where she had twisted it in the fall. Williams immediately got on his radio to coordinate the next phase of the withdrawal. Alpha leader, overwatch positions established. We have eyes on both ridge lines from here, ready to provide covering fire for the next group. Rodriguez assessed the tactical situation quickly. The first phase of their withdrawal had succeeded, but now she had to get the rest of her patrol across the same dangerous ground. The enemy had adjusted their fire and would be ready for the next group of Americans to attempt the crossing. Martinez was running low on ammunition for his machine gun, and Rodriguez knew they couldn't sustain the current rate of fire much longer. Martinez, how much ammo do you have left? Maybe one more belt, Sarge. After that, I'm down to my rifle. The machine gun had been crucial in providing the heavy suppressive fire needed for the withdrawal, and losing it would significantly reduce their ability to keep the enemy's heads down. Rodriguez had to time the next phase perfectly to make the most of their remaining firepower. Johnson was in the best tactical position to provide covering fire for the next group, and Rodriguez decided to send Martinez and Stevens next while she and Johnson covered their movement. It was another calculated risk, but it would put the machine gun in the overwatch position where it could provide support for the final withdrawal. Martinez, Stevens, you're next. Johnson and I will cover your movement. Move on my command. Rodriguez and Johnson concentrated their fire on the most active enemy positions, trying to create a lull in the incoming fire that would give Martinez and Stevens the best chance of crossing safely. The Taliban fighters were learning to time their return fire, popping up to shoot and then ducking back behind cover before the Americans could respond effectively. Through her scope, Rodriguez spotted an enemy fighter who was trying to maneuver to a better firing position on the eastern ridgeline. The fighter was moving carefully from rock to rock, trying to stay concealed while getting closer to an angle that would allow him to engage the Americans in the ravine. Rodriguez tracked the moving target carefully, leading him slightly as he moved from one piece of cover to another. When the fighter paused to check his next move, Rodriguez had her shot lined up perfectly. She controlled her breathing, steadied her aim, and squeezed the trigger smoothly. The shot was perfect. The enemy fighter spun and fell, his weapon clattering down the rocky slope. It was a clean hit at nearly 300 meters, and it demonstrated the effectiveness of Rodriguez's marksmanship training and the quality of her equipment. Target down on the eastern slope, Rodriguez reported calmly, already scanning for the next threat. Johnson had been watching the engagement and was impressed by the quality of the shot. Nice shooting, Sarge. That guy was about to flank our position in the ravine. With the immediate flanking threat eliminated, Rodriguez gave the order for the second group to move. Martinez, Stevens, go now. The machine gunner and rifleman began their sprint across the open ground, with Martinez carrying his heavy weapon and additional ammunition. The weight of his equipment slowed him down, but Stevens stayed with him to provide mutual support. Enemy fire immediately shifted to the running Americans, but Rodriguez and Johnson were ready with covering fire. They engaged every muzzle flash they could see, forcing the Taliban fighters to focus on taking cover rather than aiming carefully at the moving targets. A burst of fire from the western ridgeline came dangerously close to Martinez, and Rodriguez could see dirt kicking up around his boots as he ran. She shifted her fire to that position and sent a rapid series of aimed shots that forced the enemy gunner to duck behind cover. Stevens was running slightly ahead of Martinez when he suddenly stumbled and went down. Rodriguez's heart sank as she thought the soldier had been hit, but Stevens quickly rolled behind a small boulder and signaled that he was okay. He had tripped on the uneven ground, but he wasn't wounded. Martinez reached Stevens' position and helped him up, and the two soldiers continued their movement toward the ravine. They were only 15 meters from safety when a concentrated burst of fire from multiple positions forced them to take temporary cover behind a cluster of rocks. We're pinned down about 15 meters short of the ravine, Martinez reported. Need covering fire to make the final push. Rodriguez and Johnson increased their rate of fire, trying to suppress all the visible enemy positions simultaneously. They were burning through their ammunition quickly, but they had to give Martinez and Stevens the opportunity to reach safety. Chen and Williams were also providing covering fire from the ravine, creating crossfire that forced the enemy fighters to divide their attention between multiple American positions. The combined firepower was enough to create the suppression needed for Martinez and Stevens to make their final sprint to safety. Both soldiers reached the ravine without further incident, and Rodriguez felt a moment of relief knowing that 4 of her 6 soldiers were now in relatively safe positions. But she and Johnson were still exposed in their original positions, and they would have to make the same dangerous crossing under fire. The tactical situation had improved somewhat with 4 soldiers in overwatch positions, but Rodriguez knew that the final withdrawal would be the most dangerous. The enemy fighters would concentrate all their fire on the last 2 Americans, knowing that preventing their escape would mean the difference between a successful ambush and a failed one. Johnson checked his ammunition and found that he was down to his last 2 magazines. "Sarge, I'm running low on ammo. We need to move soon or we'll be firing single shots instead of providing covering fire." Rodriguez assessed her own ammunition situation. She had fired approximately 40 rounds and had 4 full magazines remaining. It was enough for the withdrawal if they moved quickly, but not enough for a sustained firefight. Williams was coordinating the overwatch positions from the ravine. "Alpha Leader, we're in position and ready to provide covering fire for your movement. We have good fields of fire on both ridge lines." Rodriguez made her final tactical decision of the engagement. Rather than trying to move together, she decided to send Johnson first while she provided covering fire, and then make her own dash to safety while the rest of the patrol covered her movement. "Johnson, you move first. I'll provide covering fire and follow 30 seconds behind you. Everyone else, maximum rate of fire when Johnson starts moving." Johnson acknowledged the plan and prepared for his sprint. He knew that the next few seconds would be the most dangerous of his life, but he also knew that his teammates would do everything possible to protect him during the crossing. Rodriguez prepared to unleash the most concentrated and accurate fire of her military career. The next few minutes would determine whether her patrol escaped intact or whether they would become casualties in a Taliban ambush that had been planned to perfection. The final phase of their withdrawal was about to begin, and Rodriguez knew that her marksmanship skills and tactical leadership would be tested to their absolute limits. "Move! Move! Move!" Rodriguez shouted, and Johnson exploded from his cover position like a man possessed, sprinting across the killing field with everything he had. The instant he broke cover, the valley erupted in a crescendo of gunfire as both sides unleashed everything they had. Rodriguez became a machine of precision and death, working her M4 carbine like a master craftsman. She identified targets, engaged them with carefully aimed shots, and moved to the next threat in a deadly rhythm that had been perfected through years of training and combat experience. Her ACOG scope tracked across the ridge lines, and every time she saw a muzzle flash, she answered with accurate return fire. The soldiers in the ravine were pouring suppressive fire into both ridge lines, creating overlapping fields of fire that forced the Taliban fighters to divide their attention between multiple American positions. Martinez had set up his machine gun in a position that allowed him to cover the eastern ridgeline, while Williams and Stevens engaged targets on the western slope. Johnson was halfway across the open ground when a burst of machine gun fire from a concealed position nearly cut him down. The rounds passed so close that Rodriguez could see dirt flying up from the impacts just inches from Johnson's boots. She immediately shifted her fire to the source of the threat, a well-concealed position among the rocks about 250 meters up the eastern slope. Rodriguez's first shot at the machine gun position missed, but it was close enough to force the gunner to duck behind cover. Her second shot struck the rocks near the firing position, and her third shot found its mark. The enemy machine gun fell silent, and Johnson continued his sprint towards safety. Chen was providing medical support from the ravine, but she was also adding her rifle fire to the covering fire for Johnson's movement. Despite her twisted ankle, she had positioned herself where she could engage targets on the western ridgeline, while staying ready to provide medical aid if any of her teammates were wounded. Williams was coordinating the overwatch fire and calling out targets to the other soldiers in the ravine. His experience as a radio operator had taught him to maintain situational awareness even under the stress of combat, and he was directing the team's fire toward the most dangerous enemy positions. Johnson stumbled as he neared the ravine, but he recovered his balance and dove into the safety of the depression where his teammates were waiting. He was breathing hard and covered in sweat, but he was uninjured and ready to provide covering fire for Rodriguez's withdrawal. "Alpha Leader Johnson secure. All positions ready to cover your movement," Williams reported over the radio. Rodriguez was now alone in her position, facing the concentrated fire of the remaining Taliban fighters. She could hear bullets striking the rocks around her with increasing frequency as the enemy focused all their attention on preventing her escape. The sound of incoming fire was deafening, and she could feel the percussion of near misses as rounds passed close to her position. She knew that her withdrawal would be the most dangerous movement of the entire engagement. The enemy fighters understood that if they could prevent her escape, they could claim a significant victory. Rodriguez represented not just another target, but the patrol leader whose capture or death would demoralize American forces and provide valuable propaganda for the Taliban. Rodriguez prepared for her sprint by checking her equipment one final time. She had 3 magazines remaining, plus the partially used magazine in her weapon. Her radio was secure, her first aid kit was properly attached, and her body armor was adjusted correctly. Everything had to be perfect because she would only get one chance. The soldiers in the ravine began laying down the heaviest suppressive fire of the entire engagement. Martinez was burning through his remaining machine gun ammunition, sending long bursts toward every known enemy position. Johnson, Stevens, Williams, and Chen were all firing as rapidly as they could aim, creating a wall of American firepower that forced the Taliban fighters to seek cover. Rodriguez took a deep breath, said a quick prayer, and burst from her position like a sprinter leaving the blocks. The instant she broke cover, it seemed like every Taliban fighter in the valley opened fire simultaneously. The air around her was filled with the angry buzz of passing bullets and the sharp crack of supersonic rounds. She was 20 meters into her run when she spotted something that made her blood freeze. A Taliban fighter had moved to a new position on the western ridgeline, a spot that gave him a perfect angle on her running route and was concealed from the American positions in the ravine. The fighter was tracking her movement with what appeared to be a scoped rifle, and Rodriguez realized that her teammates couldn't see him from their positions. The fighter was approximately 400 meters away, positioned among the rocks in a way that provided excellent concealment and a clear field of fire. Rodriguez could see that he was taking careful aim, preparing for a shot that would end her life and her patrol's hopes of escape. Without breaking stride, Rodriguez raised her M4 carbine and acquired the distant target through her ACOG scope. Running at full speed and trying to aim accurately at a target 400 meters away was a nearly impossible shot, but Rodriguez had no choice. If she stopped to take proper aim, other enemy fighters would have time to target her. If she ignored the threat, the concealed sniper would kill her with his next shot. Time seemed to slow down as Rodriguez's training took over. She had practiced snap shooting at long distances, but never while running for her life under fire. She could see the enemy fighter's position clearly through her scope, and she could tell that he was seconds away from firing. Rodriguez controlled her breathing despite her exertion, steadied her weapon as much as possible while running, and relied on thousands of hours of marksmanship training to guide her shot. She had learned to shoot instinctively, trusting her muscle memory and training even in the most stressful situations. The shot broke cleanly, and Rodriguez continued running without waiting to observe the results. She could hear her teammates covering fire continuing from the ravine, and she could see muzzle flashes from multiple enemy positions as the Taliban fighters tried desperately to stop her escape. Behind her, the concealed sniper who had been tracking her movement suddenly pitched forward and tumbled down the rocky slope. Rodriguez's shot had found its mark at 400 meters while running at full speed, under fire, with no opportunity for careful aim or range estimation. It was a shot that would have been difficult for a trained sniper under ideal conditions, but Rodriguez had made it while sprinting for her life. Stevens, who had been watching the western ridgeline through his scope, saw the enemy fighter fall and realized what had happened. Holy shit, Sarge got that sniper at 400 meters while running. That was an impossible shot. Rodriguez reached the ravine and dove into cover just as a concentrated burst of fire swept across the ground where she had been running. Her teammates immediately shifted their fire to cover the approaches to their position while Rodriguez caught her breath and assessed their situation. "Everyone okay?" Rodriguez asked, quickly checking each of her soldiers. Despite the intensity of the firefight, her patrol had escaped the ambush with only minor injuries. Chen's twisted ankle was painful but not serious, and Johnson had some cuts from flying rock fragments, but everyone was combat effective. Williams was already coordinating their next move with Base Command. "Base, Alpha Team has broken contact and withdrawn to defensive positions. We need immediate extraction or support. Enemy forces are still active in our area." The response came back quickly. "Alpha Team, helicopter extraction is inbound, ETA 15 minutes. Move to designated pickup zone and prepare for extraction under fire. Close air support will arrive on station in 5 minutes to suppress enemy positions." Rodriguez felt a surge of relief knowing that help was finally on the way, but she also knew they weren't safe yet. The Taliban fighters would likely pursue them and try to prevent their extraction. The next 15 minutes would require continued vigilance and tactical awareness. As they prepared to move to the extraction point, Rodriguez reflected on the engagement they had just survived. Her patrol had walked into a well-planned ambush against superior numbers and had fought their way out through superior training, equipment, and teamwork. More importantly, they had demonstrated the kind of courage and professionalism that defined the American military. The shot she had made while running would become legendary among the soldiers who witnessed it, but Rodriguez knew that individual marksmanship was only part of the story. The real victory belonged to the entire team, who had worked together under fire to overcome a tactical disadvantage and survive an engagement that could have ended in disaster. Chen was treating Johnson's cuts while the patrol prepared to move to the extraction point. "Sarge, that shot you made while running was incredible. I've never seen anything like it." Rodriguez smiled grimly as she checked her remaining ammunition. "Sometimes you get lucky, and sometimes training pays off. Today we got both." Martinez was loading his last belt of machine gun ammunition, preparing to provide covering fire for their movement to the extraction point. "The choppers are going to have to come in hot. Those Taliban fighters aren't going to just let us leave." Stevens was monitoring the ridgelines for any sign of pursuit.
"I can see movement up there. They're not giving up on this fight."
Williams received an update from Base Command.
"Alpha Team, close air support is now on station and ready to engage enemy positions on your command. Helicopter extraction will begin approach in 10 minutes. Rodriguez knew that the next few minutes would be crucial. They had to reach the extraction point without being caught in another ambush, and they had to be ready for immediate pickup when the helicopters arrived. The Taliban fighters would do everything possible to prevent their escape, knowing that a successful extraction would mean their ambush had ultimately failed. As they prepared to leave the relative safety of the ravine, Rodriguez looked back at the valley where they had nearly died. The narrow passage that had seemed so innocent that morning was now scarred with bullet impacts and evidence of the fierce firefight. It would be a place she would never forget, and a reminder of how quickly situations could change in combat. The patrol began their final movement toward home, carrying with them the knowledge that they had faced the worst that combat could offer and had emerged victorious through skill, courage, and determination. Rodriguez's shot at 400 meters would be remembered, but the real story was about 8 American soldiers who refused to quit when the odds were against them. The sound of approaching helicopters could be heard in the distance, growing stronger by the minute. They were going home, and they were going home together. In the end, that was what mattered most.